All right, welcome everybody to today's event. I'm Debbie Shulkret. I'm the chair of the Political Science Department. Before we begin, I'd like to thank all of our co-sponsors for today. In addition to the Political Science Department, today's event is also sponsored by the Psychology Department and the Tisch College of Civic Life. And I'd also particularly like to thank the political science staff, especially Andrew Alquesta and Jimmy Pavlik, for helping make sure that everything today goes smoothly. So before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to briefly turn it over to Professor Summers, who'd like to make a brief announcement.
Thank you very much, Professor Schildkraut. The Psychology Department is thrilled to be here and co-hosting this event with our colleagues. And I did want to draw everyone's attention to a talk that'll be happening next month in April. It'll be the first inaugural in what we plan to be an annual event, the Psychology of Anti-Racism Colloquium Series. Our speaker will be Dr. Jennifer Richardson from Yale University. It will be Friday, April 9th at 1:30, and I will put in the chat here the registration link so that people can register on Zoom for that talk. Her title is The Mythology of Racial Progress. We're really excited to have Dr. Richardson joining us. President Monaco will actually be introducing the series to kick things off for us. So just wanted to put that on your radar screens as something to have on your schedule for April. And I'll send things back to Professor Schildkraut to start off today's event that we're all very excited about.
Thank you so much. So for today's event, our speaker is going to offer prepared remarks for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then the rest of the time will be a moderated question period. During the talk, if you have any questions you'd like to submit, please just use the Q&A window and we'll be able to see your questions there. So I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Lilliana Mason, Associate Professor of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland, College Park. Professor Mason is the author of Uncivil Agreement: How Politics Became Our Identity. That book was just chosen for the current installment of the NPR Politics Book Club. In it, she explores the growing gulf across racial, religious, and cultural lines, which have come to divide neatly between the two major political parties. She argues that group identifications have changed the way we think and feel about ourselves and about our opponents. Even when Democrats and Republicans can agree on policy outcomes, they view one another with distrust and seem to work for party victory over all else. This work has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, and more. In 2017, she received the Emerging Scholar Award from the Political Organizations and Political Parties section of the American Political Science Association. She received her PhD in political psychology from Stony Brook University. And today, Professor Mason joins us to talk about her current book project, which she is working on with Professor Nathan Kalmoe of Louisiana State University. The title of this project is Radical American Partisanship: Prevalence and Correlates of Political Violence in American Politics. And believe it or not, we had this talk scheduled long before the insurrection on January 6th. The book examines radicalism among ordinary American partisans, including demonization, violent political attitudes and behaviors, and a win at all costs mentality that undermines democratic elections. The topic could not be more pressing and timely. And they say that their book will serve as a warning, but not a forecast of inevitable doom. And I certainly hope that's true. So please help join me in welcoming Professor Mason to Tufts. The floor is yours, Professor Mason.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this invitation. I'm really excited to be here speaking with everybody. So I'm going to, at the very start of this talk, I'm going to summarize some of the findings from the first book, just to kind of put this all in context and explain where, how we got where we are. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So yes, as we were saying, this is a book project with Nathan Kalmoe that we are hopefully finishing right now. We're in revision stage. This is hopefully going to come out within the next year is our plan. But so to give some background, thinking about polarization was sort of the idea of this first book, was looking at American politics and trying to figure out why Democrats and Republicans were seemingly really not getting along with each other. And this is data from the 2016 American National Election Study. I took these sort of 5 issues, gun control, immigration, abortion, gay marriage, and something else that I'm forgetting. That was something fiscal. And basically created 2 different measures. The one on the left is the average position. If you take everybody's positions on those 5 issues, and if they're the most extremely liberal on all 5, they'll score 0. And if they're the most extremely conservative on all 5, they'll score a 1. And 0.5 would be completely moderate or completely conflicting issue positions, right? And this is not a surprising finding, actually. This is, we've seen this over and over and over again in studies of the American electorate. The Republican Party, even people in the Republican Party, their average score on these issues, and these are not unknown issues, is to the left of center. So they're not even past 0.5, which would be the moderate place, right? They are leaning towards the left end of the spectrum on average on these issues. And Democrats are even further to the left. But that still creates, you can imagine that there's a lot of space in here for Democrats and Republicans to be agreeing on issues and finding places to compromise. I also decided to look at it maybe as, maybe the people are just sort of confused. And so I just looked at the percentage of issues that Republicans are on the right side of and Democrats are on the left side of, so the correct side for that party. And again, it's only about 40% of the issues are Democrats and Republicans consistently choosing the correct side of the issue to match their party. So again, we're looking at an electorate here that has plenty of things in common and plenty of room to compromise. But if we look at their feelings towards each other, so this is a feeling thermometer, which basically says, rate the Republican Party, the Democratic Party on this thermometer. If you feel very cold, you can rate them at 0. If you feel very warm, rate them at 100. And as you see here, Democrats feel pretty cold towards Republicans. They feel about 27 degrees of cold, of warmth or coldness. And they feel 75 degrees towards their own party. So they like their party and they really don't like the other party. The mirror image for Republicans, right? They feel warm towards Republicans. They feel cold towards Democrats. So this is not a picture of an electorate that's really getting along and having a lot in common. And this was the puzzle that really set up my first project, was how is it that we have so much room for agreement when it's very clear that Democrats and Republicans really don't like each other at all? So what's driving this discrepancy? So I turned to social psychology, and the psychology students will probably be more familiar with this theory. I turned to social identity theory, which effectively explains why there would be conflict between groups, just any groups at all, not political groups, not partisan groups. We have this theory of why there would be intergroup conflict without issue positions, without what government should do, without legislation, right? There are theories about this. And this particular theory I found really compelling, which basically set up to generate the theory. A psychologist named Marie Tajfel came up with these experiments that were called the minimal group paradigm experiments. So imagine you walk into a lab, you're the only person there, it's you and a scientist. The scientist asks you to look at this screen full of dots and estimate the number of dots that you see. You write down your answer, you give it to the scientist, and the scientist tells you that you're an overestimator. Okay, some people are underestimators, but you're an overestimator. Don't worry about it. And then much later on in the study, they say, they forget about that first part, but we want to do this money allocation study. Now, this is a big simplification of the study, but it's still, I think, representative of the effective puzzle that you're given. So you have 2 choices. You can choose between everybody in the study getting $5. You're never going to meet anybody in this study. You're alone in the lab. You're not going to meet other participants. So both overestimators and underestimators are going to get the same amount of money. Or you can choose this condition in which your group gets $4, but the other group gets 3. So you're effectively sacrificing your own group's benefits in order to get victory over the other group, in order to be superior to the other group. Tajfel actually expected, with these sort of really meaningless group labels, that everybody was going to choose the greater good condition, and that he could then add pieces of conflict to create this intergroup bias, right? But effectively, what he kept finding over and over again was that even with these very minimal groups, people were choosing this victory condition where they were sacrificing the greater good of everyone for a sense of group superiority. So when it comes to actual partisan groups, we should expect that people might be even more connected to them than they were to these minimal groups, right? Our partisan groups, our parties, are often affiliations that we feel psychologically connected to, and we feel happy when our party wins, and we feel sad when our party loses, and we're willing to go fight for the status of our party. And it's not an accident that, in fact, during the 2016 campaign, Trump really used this type of language, winning and losing, winners and losers, to evoke this really deep-seated psychological desire for people to see their own groups as superior to other groups, right? Our group status is connected to our own sense of self and our sort of place in the world. And we're motivated to maintain a positive sense of ourselves via our groups. So this is fine. This is sort of the way things naturally work. And if our party is not connected to other groups that we may belong to, ideology, I'm here treating as a social identity. So identification as a liberal or as a conservative, regardless of policy positions, which is not actually the same thing. We all have a racial identity. Some of us have religious identity. And if our party is kind of just like unrelated to all of that, when the party loses an election, that part of us hurts, but the rest of it is still okay. But if our party is really intimately connected with all of these other groups, if our party is tightly connected with our racial and religious and ideological groups in our minds, then when the party loses an election, this sort of infects our sense of self across all of these domains, which makes the loss more painful. And this is important context because when we look at the American electorate, certain things have been happening over the last few decades. This is a picture of the electorate in 1972. These bars represent, so for each of these groups, the percentage of the group that's Republicans minus the percentage of the group that's Democrats. So if the bar is red and goes out to the right, there's more Republicans in the group. If it goes to the left, there's more Democrats in the group. And the length of the bar is the sort of depth of the difference. So in 1972, we have a slight gender gap with men being slightly more Republican. Conservatives are obviously more Republican. Liberals are more Democratic. Church attenders, there's absolutely no difference. So church attenders are 50-50 Democrats and Republicans. Southerners in 1972 are Democrats still. Wealthy people are more Republican. Whites are more Republican. Blacks are more Democratic. Catholics are Democrats. Protestants are Republicans. Union members are Democrats. This is like the classic social breakdown of the Democratic and Republican parties that we all kind of think of when we think about what social groups make up the parties, right? There's a lot of differences, which is completely normal, but none of them are actually very deep, right? There's just a whole bunch of kind of minor differences between the parties. But if we look at 2016, what we see is that these differences have increased substantially, and particularly in our ideological identities, our religious identities. So we now see church attenders and Catholics and Protestants are now all leaning towards the Republican Party. And our racial divide has also expanded substantially, with white people now being much more Republican than Democratic, and Black Americans being much more Democratic than Republican. So we go from a whole bunch of kind of small divides to a few really, really deep, important divides between the parties. Now Democrats and Republicans are racially distinct, more religiously distinct, and more distinct in their sort of ideological identities. So the basic takeaway from that first book is that this idea of Democrats and Republicans becoming socially different from each other is something that I call social sorting. And when people have socially sorted identities, so that their other social identities are connected to their partisan identity in their mind, that creates more intolerance of the other party, more bias against the other party. It creates more activism regardless of policy attitudes. People become more active on behalf of their party in order to help the party win, because it feels much more dire to have that win-loss possibility. And people also become more angry and enthusiastic So emotionally volatile. That it's easier to make socially sorted people angry, and it's easier for them to become enthusiastic when they win. And these emotions are also really important because these are emotions that tend to drive action as well. So these are the findings from the first book. Basically, we have this electorate that's really invested in victory, not necessarily because they disagree with the other party on policy, but because they need that victory for psychological reasons. And that puts us in a place where we have to wonder about, sort of democratic accountability. How could anyone ever vote against their party if they need that party to win in order to feel good about themselves? So then I had this conversation with my co-author, Nathan Kalmoe, about kind of, how far do we think that the effects of, partisanship can go? We know that partisans don't like each other. We know, in fact, that they don't want to live next door to each other. They don't want to be friends with people from the other party. But that's sort of as far as our measures went in the study of American political behavior. And basically, our concept of partisanship in American political behavior was invented by this group we call the Michigan School, who were basically a bunch of guys at Michigan in the 1950s who were measuring partisanship during a time when there was very little polarization. Eisenhower was the president. He didn't even decide which party he was going to run as until the very last minute. So partisanship was a pretty harmless concept at the time they were measuring it, and they were coming up with these measures, but their measures are what we've used to this day. And so what Nathan and I started thinking about is maybe those measures didn't go far enough because they were created in this time when partisanship didn't really do much. It didn't really rile people up very much. And in today's environment, where we actually see quite a lot of party-based, partisan-based behavior that is much more radical, maybe we should be measuring things in a different way. So we started collecting data, and we ultimately narrowed our questions and our concepts down to basically these two main concepts. The first is moral disengagement, which is commonly known as a precursor to violent behavior. It's a way of sort of removing yourself from people in the other group in order to make it okay to harm them. So the way that we measured this was, would you say the other party is a serious threat to the United States and its people? The other party is not just worth for politics, they're downright evil. And the other party lacks the traits to be considered fully human. They behave like animals. So dehumanization, vilification, and feeling of threat. And then the next concept that we wanted to measure was actual advocacy of violence. So, when is it okay to send threatening messages to party leaders? When is it okay to harass ordinary partisans on the internet in a way that makes them feel frightened? How much is it justified for your party to use violence in advancing their political goals these days? And also, what if the other party wins the upcoming presidential election? How much would violence be justified then? So we've been collecting these items since 2017. We've been doing national surveys, over a dozen national surveys conducted by YouGov since 2017. And the sort of first picture is that these attitudes are relatively stable. So consistently around 60% of partisans believe that the other party is a serious threat to the United States and its people. 40 to 50% believe that outgroup partisans are evil, and around 20 to 30% are willing to dehumanize people in the other party. When it comes to violence, this is a lot less popular, which is a good thing, right? We're happy to see this. From 2017 until around February, sort of right before coronavirus hit, we had consistently around 10% of people saying it's okay to threaten citizens and leaders, and violence today is justified. It's important to point out, when we then ask them to think about what if you lose in the 2020 election, violence becomes considered more justified, right? Almost doubled from 10 to 20%. Interestingly, around the election, we see a little lull in pro-violent feelings, although violence today kind of keeps ticking up during this period. And then this last data point is data that we got from just like a week or two ago. So this is February data, where all of a sudden we're seeing these attitudes increase substantially to levels that we actually haven't seen them at ever before since the 2017, so the first time we studied this. So the first question, I know word clouds are awful, but I just want to give you a sense. The first question that we were sort of wondering about in terms of our measure is, what are people thinking about when they say that violence is justified, right? What does violence actually mean to people? Because maybe people are thinking about, something that we don't actually consider to be violence. So in one of our studies, we asked people to just, in an open-ended answer, what were you thinking when you said that violence was at least a little bit justified? So we got a bunch of different answers, and based on these answers, we created a new closed-ended question that we asked in a follow-up study. This is actually from the 2020 election study. We asked people to choose any of these things. So these numbers don't add up to 100 because they could choose any of these things. What is acceptable when you say violence? What does violence mean when you said it's okay? And relatively few people actually say like widespread violence by armed groups that kill a lot of people. So that's great. That's good news. Even the people who are saying violence is justified are generally not thinking about mass killings. But we have increasing numbers of people saying maybe violence by armed individuals that might kill a few people, punching people, getting into fist fights. These first three categories are what we think of as violence. But 23% of people were thinking destruction of property is legitimate. 28% were saying verbal insults and harassment are legitimate ways to engage in violence. 20% were thinking of something else that we didn't include, and a full 40% said none of these things. So 40% of the people who said violence is justified, when they're asked to actually choose a type of violence, they get really uncomfortable and they don't want to choose something. So this, puts a slight damper on that number, that 10 to 25% number, understanding that the 10 to 25% of those 10 to 25% of people, a lot of them are actually not thinking about super violent types of violence, but about 20% of them might be. Okay, the big question is always, how are the parties different in these measures? And in general, we've really found that they're not that different across the range of time. We're seeing, in terms of moral disengagement, Republicans slightly higher than Democrats on feeling that they're a threat, thinking that they're evil, dehumanizing them. We do see this increasing distance in the most recent studies, starting from last summer, where Republicans are kind of moving away from Democrats, increasingly thinking about 10 percentage points more than Democrats that the other party is a threat, evil, and not human. Although in our most recent wave, as you can see, those numbers for Democrats also increased. They just didn't increase to the extent that Republicans' feelings increased. In terms of violence, we've actually seen through most of this time that Democrats tended to be more approving of violence through the entire time series, except right at the election. And you can see that right after the election, all of a sudden they switch, and now Republicans are more approving of violence than Democrats are. So we think that this is probably an artifact of just being in power or being out of power, feeling like you're in power or out of power. We also asked in our most recent wave, if your out party wins in 2024, I'm sorry, if your that's incorrect. If your party loses in 2024, how much would it be justified? And both Republicans and Democrats, again, are thinking it'd be more justified if we lose. Okay, so what are the predictors of these attitudes? We looked for both political violence and moral disengagement. One of the most consistent and effective predictors of both of these things is just trait aggression. So personality, non-political, have you ever hit someone? Do you get angry often? Just, are you an aggressive person? That is our most consistent and most effective predictor of both of these types of attitudes, which we think actually provides some validity to these scales. The types of people who believe in violence are the types of people who tend to be violent. But also our second most consistent predictor is identification with your party. So feeling socially identified with your political party. And this is measured by asking questions like, when you talk about Democrats, do you say we rather than they? To what extent do you feel like being like you are a Republican, depending on which party you're in? So basically we have, this aggressiveness is pushing this, but also strong social attachments to our party are increasing our approval of both violence and moral disengagement. We also wanted to look into things that have also, first of all, provoked violence in the US for a long time, and some of the main roots of the real partisan divide that we're seeing recently, where the biggest trend in the difference between partisan opinions is about the traditional social hierarchy. Are white men still at the top of that hierarchy? Should they be? And if they shouldn't, then what should we be doing about it? So we also asked this racial resentment scale. It has some problems, but it's okay, I think, for this purpose. Basically, these questions this is a standard set of questions that essentially gauge, do you believe that there is systemic and structural racism? Right, the most common: Irish, Italian, and Jewish and many other minorities overcame prejudice and worked their way up. Blacks should do the same without any special favors, etc. And when we looked at this measure by party, we found this really interesting result, which is that for Republicans, as they become more racially resentful, they're much more morally disengaged from Democrats. So the Republicans who are high in racial resentment are most likely to believe that Democrats are a threat, Democrats are evil, and Democrats are not human. The Republicans who are very low in racial resentment are actually pretty accepting of Democrats. They don't believe these things. They're sort of the most morally engaged partisans that we can find. For Democrats, it's actually slightly opposite relationship, where very racially resentful Democrats are more likely to think that Republicans are kind of okay people, but it's a very slight effect. The reason for this, we believe, is that on average, Democrats, as I said before, this is an increasing divide between the parties. On average, Democrats tend to be low in racial resentment, to score a 0.3 on a 0 to 1 scale, and Republicans score a 0.7 on a 0 to 1 scale. So for Democrats, being high in racial resentment is a cross-cutting attitude. It's a cross pressure that allows them to feel some sympathy for Republicans. It makes them feel closer to them. And for Republicans who are very low in racial resentment, that's a cross-cutting attitude. They understand Democrats. They feel some sympathy for Democrats because they have this common attitude with them. But for Republicans who are very high in racial resentment, that just makes them a better Republican. It makes them a more loyal and more consistent Republican, and it helps them to distance themselves from Democrats. We also looked at sexism for the same exact reason. We used the hostile sexism scale. There are many scales of sexism that can be used. We just chose this one. This is, again, a commonly used scale. Most women fail to appreciate what men do for them. Most women interpret innocent remarks as being sexist, etc. And again, we find this similar relationship where Republicans who are very low in sexism are not very morally disengaged from Democrats. They don't think of them as threats, they don't think of them as evil, and they don't think of them as animals. But Republicans who are very high in sexism do believe that Democrats are threatening, evil, and animalistic. That for Democrats, that relationship is non-existent. So it doesn't matter what level of sexism a Democrat has, it has absolutely no relationship to how they feel about Republicans. It's just completely not related at all in any way. So, and again, this is most likely because we have these average differences between Democrats and Republicans in their levels overall of hostile sexism, with Democrats scoring 0.3 on average and Republicans scoring 0.6 on average. So this is one, we think, really interesting element of this, where we have some evidence that part of the reason Democrats and Republicans are kind of pulling apart from each other is that they're separating on this issue of racism, sexism, what the traditional social hierarchy should be. Okay, so thinking about things we can do. So we have in a number of our studies, we tried to look at interventions. So things that we could do to reduce these attitudes and change the way that people think about violence and think about the other party. And one of the things that we consistently found is that leader rhetoric can really, really help. We had people read this quote from Biden. This is a real Biden quote. We told them it was Biden that said it. Violence directed at anyone because of their political opinions is never acceptable. And then we asked the political violence questions. For part of the sample, they read this quote. Another part of the sample read nothing at all. And what we found, we were actually kind of surprised. What we found is that so the gray line is people who didn't read anything. They didn't read the Biden quote. For them, as their party, as they become stronger and more and more strongly attached to their party, they become more approving of violence. This is similar to what we thought earlier, right? Stronger party attachments, higher approval of political violence. But the crazy thing is, when they read this message from a political leader, that relationship reverses. So the strongest partisans are now the least approving of partisan violence. And this is really important because these are the people who tend to be the most approving of violence in society. And it's possible for leaders, this demonstrates that it's possible for leaders to reach them, right? If our leaders are consistent in their anti-violence messaging, they can actually take the people who are at the highest risk of approving of violence and reduce that approval. We believe that this is partly because of sort of, loyalty and group norms and sort of just following the rules of the group if you're strongly identified. We haven't entirely isolated the mechanism yet, but that's what we think is going on. Not shown here, but also we tried using messages from just like regular people on the internet. So we showed people a tweet from a random person that was decrying political violence, and that also did exactly the same thing. It actually did reverse violent attitudes. So regular people's messaging matters. Our leaders' messaging matters. It's important for us to be out there saying anti-violent things because it does seem to help. Okay, so what's the big takeaway from all of this? Basically, we can think of this in two ways. There's the pessimistic case, which is we've learned from our comparativist friends that in other countries, when racial, ethnic, religious, and cultural divides fall along partisan lines, so they match the party divides, the likelihood of violence and civil war tends to go up. We tend to be more, or not we, but all people, nations tend to have higher risks of devolving into violence when they have this type of sorting, this type of social alignment around their partisan divides. So that's bad news. Another thing is that the last time our partisan divide was perfectly aligned with our racial policy divide was before the Civil War, when Democrats and Republicans were on absolutely opposite sides of what they believed our racial policy. I mean, it's ending slavery, but the racial policy is an understatement. But what they believed the nation's racial progress should be. And then the last time that we really had a big movement, the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and we had real legislation to enact policies that would help increase civil rights, we had a lot of social tumult, but we didn't have the type of Democrat versus Republican hatred we have now, because both parties were divided on civil rights legislation. Both Republicans and Democrats voted for those civil rights bills, and both Democrats and Republicans opposed those civil rights bills. So we didn't actually have a partisan divide during that period of time. This period of time is therefore somewhat unique. And so the bad, right, the pessimistic takeaway is maybe as a country, we're really just not capable of doing this. It's, maybe we really just can't deal with this. We're never going to be able to deal with this on a national level. We've never successfully had any kind of, truth and reconciliation, racial reckoning. It's never really fully happened. And so maybe it's not possible. On the optimistic side, we have seen remarkable changes in the racial attitudes of white Democrats over the last few years. So we can see, of Democrats who say the country needs to continue making changes to give Blacks equal rights with whites. This is from Pew Studies. In 2009, white Democrats, 50% of them agreed with that. By 2017, 80% of white Democrats agreed with that. And we can see that this is happening really mainly among the within the Democratic Party. The Republican Party is making some gains, but they're much smaller, and they're sort of inconsistent. We also, this is data from 2019. We're seeing this really impressive, not good, but serious divide between Democrats and Republicans in what they think about racial progress. This is just looking at white Republicans and Democrats. When it comes to giving Black people equal rights with whites, our country has 64% of Democrats say not gone far enough, 31% of Republicans say gone too far, and 53 say we're good. The legacy of slavery affects the position of Black people in American society today. 59% of Republicans saying not much, not at all. 80% of Democrats saying a great deal or a fair amount. And when it comes to racial discrimination, the bigger problem for the country today is 77% of Republicans saying seeing discrimination where it does not exist. 78% of Democrats saying not seeing discrimination where it really does exist, right? So this divide is very, very clear and has become much more clear between white Democrats and white Republicans. But what this means is that we have a large group of white people who are now actually on the side of believing at least that structural racism exists. They're not necessarily going to do anything about it, right? So that's another challenge, but they do admit and believe that structural racism exists. And so that brings up this question is, are we in kind of the bumpy part of the road that we're going to have to get through if we're ever going to become a fully representative multiracial democracy? Having these white voices in the Democratic Party and having kind of an entire political party that is increasingly believing in this idea that we need to make racial progress, having an entire political party behind that idea is sort of unprecedented in terms of the power that's available to people who want this agenda to move forward. And you can just imagine, do like a thought experiment. If we were to have an American reckoning with our legacy of racial violence and racial prejudice and injustice, what would happen? Just the logical next thought in your head should be that we would see a backlash from white supremacy. It's almost unimaginable to believe that that would not happen. And so therefore, what we're seeing right now might just be that. We might be in that, right? And we should be seeing that happen most forcefully among people whose identities are most tied to these sort of white and male, traditionally highest in a social hierarchy identities, people who need those identities to support their own sense of self-esteem and self-worth. And we're seeing a lot of this in kind of rural America, rural white America, where people have been feeling condescended to, looked down upon, have felt resentful towards liberals and people in cities. And these are the people that tended to be the most fervent Trump supporters. And Trump also had this very overtly racist agenda. He made it very clear where he stood on the traditional social hierarchy. So the main sort of question that I leave us with here is whether this is the bumpy part of the road and eventually we'll get to the smooth part where we have a better democracy, or whether American democracy is capable of doing this, capable at all of doing this. And is this the bumpy part of the road that just sort of like, and then we go off the road? And that question hasn't been answered yet. we're still thinking about that as a nation and trying to get through it as a nation. And I'm very happy to answer questions or hear thoughts about this. And I will just stop there.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Professor Mason. That was a very, very interesting and timely, and of course sobering review of these issues. But we really do appreciate it, and we're looking forward to some opportunity to have some question and answer here. So again, just to remind you, as Andrew's posted in the chat, if you have questions, to please submit them through the Q&A option on Zoom, and I'll go ahead and voice the first question for you. So this is a question that comes from Adam, who asks, is it new that political party has become one of these identities that people see as being just as salient as other deep identities like race and religion? And if so, what do you think are some of the reasons for this increase in the importance of political party in this particular moment?
Yeah, that's a great question. So people don't always associate with their party in a sort of intensely identity-based and social way. But because we've had this process of sorting that's really been happening since the 1960s, when the Southern Democrats were really unhappy with the civil rights legislation, and then gradually moved away, white Southern Democrats, and then gradually moved away from the Democratic Party toward the Republican Party. But they hated the Republican Party at that time. You have to remember, white Southern Democrats thought of Republicans as the aggressors in the Civil War. There was no way that they were going to identify as Republicans. And so it really took a full generation for white Southerners to move completely over into the Republican Party. And by the time that happened, really in the 1990s, early 2000s, it was very clear that the Republican Party was now kind of representing white America. And that message really came through. So this racial connection to parties allowed people to feel much, much more strongly connected to their political party. And in fact, there's good political science work out there right now finding that when you prime people to think about parties, they think about their racial group. When you prime people to think about racial groups, they think about the party. So these identities are really connected in people's minds. To the extent that that's true, people are really, really emotionally and psychologically connected to their parties. And that's true right now.
So we had a few people ask about the role of age in this, and I'm going to use my prerogative as moderator to add in also the intersection between age and race possibly. I don't recall seeing in your tables of the predictors race listed as one of them. So I'd be interested in that, but also this question of, is there an age divide on this? And is this something where age and race might also work together?
That's a great question. So I haven't looked at age and race, but in general, age is age has a negative relationship with approval of political violence, and I think that's mainly just like grown-ups are less, like younger people are more inclined to agree to kind of risky things. With race, this is a really great question, and we do have a chapter like breaking this down by different political identities or different social identities, and race has the type of relationship you would imagine where white Democrats are, because they're cross-pressured, are generally slightly less morally disengaged from Republicans, whereas Black Democrats are more morally disengaged from Republicans because they've got these consistent set of identities. But also evangelical white Democrats are less morally disengaged from Republicans because that evangelical identity is a cross-cutting identity. And even evangelical Black Democrats are less morally disengaged from Republicans because that's a cross-cutting identity. So we do see these effects of people who hold an identity that's more common in the other party are less morally disengaged and less approving of violence in general.
We have a couple of questions of people asking about the role that media play, the role that social media play in the processes that you've been discussing. And so I guess the way to phrase this question would be, do you think that news coverage, social media has exacerbated this divide that seems to exist in our society? Since it's such a day-to-day part of our lives, is our media shaping or just reflecting this divide? What's the role that all different types of media are playing in the processes you're talking about here today?
Yeah, absolutely. The media are playing a role. I mean, I like to think of that as just like a whole other book, right? But in general, the way that I see it is that particularly something like cable news or internet, sort of partisan news on the internet has first of all allowed people to figure out which group they belong with, right? So which party matches them becomes much easier to find out when you have partisan news helping you find that out. And that was also further exacerbated by simply the presidency of Barack Obama. Right? Michael Tesler has a lot of work, has great work on this, basically saying that low information voters who generally aren't even paying attention to politics at all and don't really care, and maybe they were Democrats because they were union members or because their parents were Democrats, when they see the face of a Black president, regardless of his policies or anything that he does, that provides information to them on a sort of group-based level. It becomes a racial cue, and that can change people's evaluations of the party, which then, of course, Trump just took over and kind of ran with. But so the first thing I think is that the media allow people, increasingly partisan media allow people to know which side they're supposed to be on in all of these sort of intergroup conflicts, which side their party represents, and then to become more loyal to those groups, aligning themselves with the party.
All right, so we have a question about what about the potential for violence when partisanship is not aligned with other identities. We often think that the pre-civil rights era consensus in which racial conservatives were prominent in both parties was instrumental in permitting continued violence against Black Americans. So the question is, does unaligned identities create conditions for racial or religious groups to be scapegoated or ganged up upon?
Yeah, exactly. That's a great question. This is like the benefits of polarization, right? When we had no polarization or low polarization in the 70s and 80s, what that basically meant was everyone was agreeing not to do anything about race, right? The white supremacists in the South were moving, sort of switching parties, and it was unclear who belonged where and what the parties were standing for because people were kind of switching in the process of switching slowly. And what that did was, it blinded us to, first of all, any further legislation that we could enact on racial justice. People in Congress could cooperate as long as they agreed not to talk about race, right? As long as they agreed not to legislate on racial issues and racial justice, then all of those people in Congress could work together because they were agreeing to just avoid that issue completely. And it definitely did allow matters of racial justice in the U.S. to be basically ignored, and that's sort of why my kind of optimistic view is maybe we have to do this, right? That in order to have any movement towards racial justice, we're going to have a huge, powerful political force like a party behind that movement, and it's going to create polarization. There's just no way around it, and this may just be what we have to do in order to get through that place.
So I'm going to do what my colleague, Professor Schildkraut, did here and take a little executive liberty. And we have two questions that I think provides sort of a nice bookends on the same issue. So the first question is if a large source of the hostility is the identity threat felt by white Republicans, wouldn't a crucial way forward be to try to find a way of reducing that feeling of threat, i.e., helping them feel more like they have a role to play in the future other than as potential losers in a zero-sum conflict? That's one question. And then we have sort of right next to that question in the Q&A, to what degree is polarization a consequence of one of the two parties actually becoming really extreme in their policies? And the implication there is sort of a reference to some of the data you presented regarding racism and sexism scale scores in Republicans versus Democrats.
That's both important questions. So I think I'll do the second one first because I think it'll sort of answer the first one, which I'm increasingly of the mind that polarization is not the problem with American politics, democracy is. And if we have one party moving sort of in the direction of authoritarianism, and anti-democracy, we should see polarization, because we would hope the other party would stand their ground and not move, in the direction of fascism along with them, just in the interest of anti-polarization, right? In that sense, polarization is not the problem. It's that one of the parties is moving in an anti-democratic direction. And a corollary to that, though, is that the people whose attitudes have changed the most in the last 10 to 15 years have really been white Democrats, right? White Democrats have become much more accepting of the concept of structural racism. And that's part of the reason that we have this white Republican backlash, because white Americans are really dividing, right, about whether or not white Americans have any role to play, and whether our government has any role to play in fixing this entire system that we have been, kind of just living in and not talking about, or talking about through euphemisms. And so I agree that when we have one party that's moving in an anti-democratic direction in order to maintain their own power and to suppress the votes of groups that have been historically suppressed, we should see polarization, right? We would hope for that. But that brings us back to the first question, which is, shouldn't we be placating? Shouldn't we be like helping these people feel better about themselves? And I don't think it's necessarily that we need to take them out of a zero-sum game or make them feel better about themselves. But I think there is, there's some like overtly white supremacist element that's just like, there's nothing anybody can do about that. And it's interesting, Biden himself in his inaugural address, actually, he said, if enough of us, and then he paused and he said, enough of us can agree to do this, right? So he's even admitting there are going to be some of us who are never, ever, ever going to go along with this. But the sort of racial grievance politics is something that our leaders can either exacerbate or reduce. And we're always going to have, I think, a two-party system. It's always going to feel like kind of a zero-sum partisan game. But if we don't have a figure like Trump kind of constantly beating the drum of approving of white supremacy and talking about people in racist ways, it's possible that element of our identities can become less salient, and other parts of our identities can become more salient, and those parts of our identities might actually be more productive to use when we talk about politics. That's sort of the hope for the future.
So do you have any intent of getting additional data before this book gets wrapped up and go to press? I'm wondering if at the graphs you showed that showed the uptick among both Democrats and Republicans in support for violence, you could imagine, say, that for Democrats, part of this could be, we just witnessed an attack and we need to fight back, rather than we need to engage in violence if we lose, but we can't just sit by and let this happen. So I wonder how much of what that uptick was a sense of acting in defense, but in a way that might require engaging in some violence.
Yeah, and actually, Bright Line Watch had a really good had a survey on this where they specifically asked the follow-up question: what if the other party starts it first? Basically, like what if they do something violent, then would it be acceptable to engage in violence? And I think that number, so we have similar numbers to them in sort of the baseline question, but they saw that number go from 10 to 20% up to about 40% of partisans saying, okay, if they start it, then yeah, that's fine. We also saw that YouGov did a survey, like I think the evening of January 6th, where they found something like 40-something% of Republicans were approving of political violence on the evening of the event. And that declined, that there was a decay in that pretty rapidly. And I think that's partially because we had leaders basically saying, no, that was not okay. We can defend other things, but we're not going to defend that. Yeah.
So you may have touched on this a little bit. If you had the ear of President Biden regarding your research, what would you want to tell him?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of this research, I would, encourage him, which I think he already knows, to definitely, engage in anti-violent rhetoric as much as possible. We actually saw Republicans responding to his anti-violent message in our studies. They didn't respond to Trump. We found some Trump quotes, and people did not really listen to him, and we think that's because he didn't have that as a consistent message. If they just read this one sentence in one survey, it didn't really convince them. But thinking about Biden, who's consistently saying this, did change people's minds. But I think, yeah, consistency in discouraging this type of violence, and honestly just continuing to try to make progress on racial justice. It's going like I think that there is no way to avoid this backlash that we're currently in. I think it's going to keep happening for a while, but the only way to get to a place where we actually have a multiracial democracy is for Biden to keep working on it. And you can't kind of back down because there's a white supremacist backlash. We know that's going to happen inevitably regardless. So I would really push him to just keep focusing on that and try to make as much progress on that as possible, so that eventually the nation can see itself as, a real multiracial democracy, and that's something to be proud of.
Great. So I want to pivot a little bit and ask a question maybe for some of the students in our audience. If you could talk a little bit about what some of the challenges were in doing this research, as from a methods perspective. Are there things you wish you had done differently? And just talk about some of the process a little bit.
Yeah. So we started out with like 30 items, like 30 different questions that we were asking, and we've over a dozen surveys have kind of narrowed it down to the 3 for moral disengagement and the 4 for political violence. So, I mean, and that part I'm really happy that we did, because we were able to kind of figure out which items work the best to accurately measure these concepts. We had definitely some pushback from respondents who were really upset about these questions. And we do have a very big preface to this bank of questions where we say, like, we're going to ask you some uncomfortable questions about politics. Your answers are anonymous. We had to add, so for each person, we knew their party. And so we just plugged in their partisanship into those questions. So they were only reading about their own party. And some people didn't realize that that's what was happening. And they were like, what is this, some kind of like propaganda thing where you're only asking me about, like, are Democrats evil? So then we had to preface that with, you're being randomly assigned to a party, and some people are going to answer questions about Republicans and some people are answering questions about Democrats. So I think that there are things lessons that we learned along the way about answering difficult and sensitive questions, and how to kind of help your respondents feel comfortable and not feel like you're kind of doing something gross and awful. We had one survey company just refuse to run the questions, like they just wouldn't do it. And that was what it was. But our IRBs haven't had problems with them. So yeah, I mean, I think one of the things to think about that's like a lesson to learn from this is, when you're trying to kind of push the boundaries of a concept, because that's sort of what we were doing, is like, how radical can partisanship be? How far can we go with this? And we kind of thought that the like violence part would be pretty much where people kind of wouldn't go. But I think it's a good lesson in, take your concept, push your concept. Like, how far can the thing that you're measuring actually go? And what assumptions are we making when we measure things, that when the measures were invented during a period of time that maybe isn't exactly like the political context today, and thinking about, like, just updating our measures, thinking about theoretically how we define concepts, and what are the extremes of where we can try to understand these concepts.
Excellent. I apologize for my brief sabbatical by virtue of Wi-Fi crashing. But a couple of questions we wanted to make sure we also were able to get to. One of them is, what do you imagine happening if our democracy goes off the road? That presumably becomes a more polarized and harmful situation, but what is it that we envision happening in that scenario?
So in my terrible and nightmare imagination, it's just a move away from democracy, right? That would be a failure of democracy. It's, in that scenario, the backlash, which is kind of the really extremist part of the Republican Party, they win. That's the car going off the road, in which case we lose a representative democracy, we lose any hope of having, having free and fair elections. We lose potentially, a lot of our, kind of media, freedom of various freedoms in the First Amendment that's possible for a lot of things that we currently consider, central to democracy could disappear. So that's my nightmare scenario is basically democratic backsliding to the extent that, the US isn't really considered a democracy.
Well, and then I guess as a nice follow-up to that, what advice do you have for how best to circumvent the fall of democracy? And the questioner writes here, all melodrama aside, I'm wondering what I should be doing, especially as someone who largely interacts with other people who see the world in a similar way that I do. What advice do you have for us as individual members of the society?
Yeah. So I mean, I think it depends on who we are. I do think that it is incumbent upon white Americans to really, really get behind the movement for racial justice. It is something that has been, allocated to people of color for a very, very long time. The protest this summer, showed some change in the types of crowds that are willing to come out and support this type of progress and legislation. But honestly, what's happening right now is that the parties are fighting over basically what an American is and who is allowed to have the full protections of being an American citizen. And that's, thinking about these sort of 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and what they mean for the reality of what our democracy is supposed to be. And, we haven't lived up to the full intent of those amendments. And we've seen a lot of backsliding in terms of our commitment to those amendments. But I think it's really incumbent upon white Americans to pay attention to what's happening in the racial justice movements and really to try to get involved and to get other people involved. This is not going to go away. This is going to be a battle. This is not about sort of pacifying the other side at this point, right? We have very, very radicalized white supremacist forces, and we're not ideally going to compromise with that, which means you have to take a position. It's just going to be a really, really raucous time in American politics. That's my expectation, is that it's going to be, you're going to have to take a position, and there's going to be conflict, and it's going to suck for a while, but that's the only way through it.
Well, it seems like the trick is to find a way to do what you're suggesting while also encouraging more the messaging, like in your experiment with Joe Biden, and kind of pairing those two in might be a way forward. And what a person posted a question that I think a lot of us grapple with is factoring in or being cognizant of your own political biases when you do research like this, your own preferences, first of all, just of what you think makes a good, stable, healthy democracy, but also your own identities, whether you adopt a partisan identity or an ideological identity. And how do you check to ensure that that's not shaping your research and the questions that you ask?
Yeah. So I've been thinking about this a lot, and one of the issues that I think has been problematic for political scientists and journalists also, I think we're both bound by the same thing, which is that we are very strongly trained that we are to be absolutely nonpartisan. That's number one. And number two is that we are pro-democracy, right? Those are the two things that we know about ourselves as political scientists and also American journalists. When those two things come into conflict, though, which is what started happening during the Trump administration, that became a lot harder for us. And it, ultimately forced, Seth Masket wrote a really good piece in the Atlantic or the Pacific Standard about the crisis of teaching political science under Trump, where basic things that we consider, pillars of democracy became partisan issues. And so ultimately, me personally, if I have to choose between being nonpartisan and being pro-democracy, I'm going to choose being pro-democracy, but that doesn't mean that I'm moving toward my party it means that if one party is being anti-democratic, we should be able to say that. And be honest about it, right? I tell my students that, I have a list of the 7 pillars of democracy that I teach them in the beginning of, the semester. And that's been the same list for the last 10 years. It hasn't changed. But 10 years ago when I taught it, they couldn't tell by that list which party I supported. And then during the Trump administration, I give the same list of the same 7 pillars of democracy. And by supporting all of those things, they know I'm a Democrat all of a sudden, right? Like, because Trump was against a lot of these things that we consider to be deeply embedded in democracy and truly important institutionally in terms of our norms. The fact that that list didn't change, right? But people's perceptions of what party I was affiliated with did suggest to me that it's, even though we're supposed to be nonpartisan, we still need to be able to hold both parties to account in adhering to the rules and norms and institutions of democracy. And if we can't do that as American political scientists, then yeah, I think we should be able to do that.
As you were giving that answer, I was thinking about how a lot of the graphs you showed, since you've been asking these questions since 2017, on some of the measures, Republicans were higher than Democrats, but Democrats were not at zero on these things. Democrats were still higher levels than I think we'd all be comfortable seeing. If you've got 10 to 20% of respondents in a political party agreeing with these measures, that's still troublesome. So, it's not all just on one side. And one thing I was wondering also if you were able to look at is things like, gun ownership, and if that's related to this at all. I know that, supporting the NRA is different from owning guns, and so you could look at this multiple ways, but there's this idea also that, well, okay, that Republicans were a little bit higher also is the side that aligns with the NRA. Is this the side that actually has more arms among civilians or not? And so I'm curious to know if there's any data that you can speak to on.
Yeah, we've recently received that question a number of times, and we haven't had gun ownership on these studies, but that's our next addition for our next study. We want to make sure that we get that, because we just hadn't been thinking about people running around with guns. I don't know why, but we just hadn't been considering it that way. And yeah, no, there should be a qualitative difference between a bunch of violent people that are unarmed and a bunch of violent people that are armed, right? There's a difference between those two groups of people. And I think it's an important caveat. I also want to just point out that Democrats and Republicans have very similar levels of these attitudes consistently. But the important thing to remember that it's also not for the same reasons, right? Like what we're seeing for Republicans is that the thing that's driving those attitudes is really this high sense of racial resentment and kind of maintaining the traditional social hierarchy, right? That's what's driving these feelings among Republicans. And among Democrats, it's sort of the opposite thing, which is trying to change these traditional social hierarchies. And so they're both feeling really angry and really don't like each other. But what I would say is it's not because they're both equally extreme. It's because they're both fighting over something that's super important, right? They're fighting over something that is crucial for American society, and it's defining who we are as a nation. And that's why both sides are feeling so riled up, because this is a crucial issue. This is a crucial topic in American politics. And so they don't believe the same things, but they're both riled up because it's such an important question.
Yeah, and going back to this point about arms, when you had the word cloud up, I was trying to look and see as many of them. I saw the word eggs in there, yeah. And I saw forks. Yeah. And so I was thinking, when people must be given examples of the types of things that they either see or can imagine doing, yeah. Or
there was a lot of like throwing eggs, like just like not hurting somebody, but like, throwing stuff at them, or, people also would write things like, I wouldn't go as far as, like, they would put limits on it. They would say, I wouldn't go as far as, killing a person, but maybe punching someone would be really satisfying, or something like that.
So I think we have time for one more question. There's one question that's been waiting for a bit, is if you could comment on some of the recent violence against Asian Americans and how this does or does not fit into the story that you've been telling.
Yeah, that's the question I have not received yet. Yeah, so my first guess is that the most of the violence against Asian Americans is related to racial assumptions about COVID, which has also been politicized, and so I mean, there's really interesting research on kind of the partisanship of Asian Americans and how, in general, at least within people who identify as Asian American, there is a very strong connection between being identifying as a Democrat and feeling a sense of having been discriminated against. And so people who hold that identity and also feel that they've been discriminated against because of that identity tend to be more in the Democratic Party. The people who are conducting violence against them, I think that's partially just plain old racism and not necessarily a partisan thing at all. And just because, I mean, what I would connect it to is Trump calling it the China virus, right? Trump's rhetoric basically put a target on a bunch of Americans, and his supporters followed what he said. I mean, leadership matters in the other direction too, right? Pacifying rhetoric is important, but vilifying rhetoric is also important and can have a real effect. And I think that's a big part of what Trump really did, was to point at targets for people who are angry and give them a place to go, beat people up.
Great. Well, I told my students before today that I said this talk is going to be fascinating. It won't be an upper, but it's really important. But I have to say, I feel like there's a way forward in here, but like you say, it's probably more bumpy times ahead. So thank you so much for joining us today, and congratulations on the selection for the NPR Politics Book Club, and for this new book being soon to be a book that we can add to our shelves and dig into in more detail. So thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation. This was a lot of fun. Thanks for all the great questions.